Picture this. Imagine yourself meandering through the labyrinthine cobblestone streets of ancient Rome, right in the heart of the year 67 AD, where the air is thick with the scents of incense, baked bread, and the distant roar of crowds in the Colosseum. Suddenly, you catch a glimpse of a scene that freezes the very marrow in your bones, a moment so surreal it defies comprehension. There, striding confidently through the Grand Forum, is none other than the Emperor himself, Nero, the unchallenged ruler of an empire spanning continents. By his side walks what appears to be his newest consort, a vision of ethereal beauty, her form swathed in luxurious silken robes that cascade like waterfalls of moonlight, adorned with jewels that sparkle like captured stars from distant realms. Yet, as they pass, a ripple of uneasy whispers spreads through the onlookers like a chill wind. For beneath the glamour lies a secret so dark it stains the soul. Everyone in the know understands the horrifying reality. That graceful woman accompanying the most powerful figure on earth was, not long ago, a young boy named Sporus, and the atrocities Nero committed against him, twisting body and mind alike, stand as one of the most profoundly disturbing chapters of psychological torment and physical violation ever etched into the annals of human history. Before we immerse ourselves deeper into these shadowy, long-forgotten narratives of human endurance amid unimaginable suffering, allow me to pause for a moment. If you find yourself captivated by the thrill of unearthing history's concealed truths, the raw, unvarnished stories that textbooks often gloss over, then I encourage you to show your appreciation by hitting that like button and subscribing to ensure you never miss out on more explorations like this one. Additionally, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Share where in the world you're listening from right now. It's truly mesmerizing to think about how, in this digital age, we're all connected in our quest to unravel these ancient mysteries, bridging vast oceans, time zones, and even millennia through our collective curiosity about the echoes of the past. But make no mistake, what unfolds before you isn't simply another lurid anecdote of Roman decadence and imperial extravagance, the kind that fills popular tales of gladiators and feasts. No, this is a far more intricate and harrowing saga, a profound examination of how absolute, unchecked power can corrupt the human heart, morphing what begins as genuine affection into a suffocating obsession, transforming raw grief into a spiral of utter madness, and ultimately reducing a living, breathing individual into nothing more than a marionette, a lifelike doll engineered solely to fulfill the warped fantasies of one deranged mind. The name Sporus might not immediately evoke recognition in your thoughts. It's not as infamous as Caesar or Cleopatra. Yet, once you delve into his plight, his story will embed itself in your consciousness, haunting your reflections long after the final words fade away. A testament to the fragility of identity and the depths of cruelty. To truly grasp the magnitude of this tragedy, we must first turn our gaze to the man at its center, the architect of such profound devastation, Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known simply as Nero. Contrary to the monstrous caricature painted by later historians, Nero wasn't born into villainy. His origins and early years hinted at something far more promising. Born in 37 AD to a lineage fraught with political intrigue, he ascended to the imperial throne in 54 AD at the tender age of just 16, following the suspicious death of his adoptive father, Emperor Claudius. In those initial halcyon days of his reign, Rome buzzed with optimism. Many citizens dared to dream that they were on the cusp of a veritable golden age, a renaissance under a youthful, vibrant leader. Nero implemented reforms that endeared him to the populace. He dramatically reduced burdensome taxes on the lower classes, poured funds into lavish public entertainments like chariot races and theatrical spectacles, and even personally performed on stage as an actor and musician, blending imperial dignity with a populist flair that delighted the common folk and set him apart from his more stoic predecessors. However, as the ancient adage warns, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and Nero's story serves as a stark illustration of this timeless truth. By the year 65 AD, the seeds of darkness that had always lurked within him had blossomed into something irreparably fractured in his psyche. What triggered this descent? Historians speculate endlessly. Perhaps it was the perpetual paranoia that plagues any Autocrat, the gnawing awareness that in an empire of over 60 million souls, countless ambitious schemers coveted his throne, plotting in shadowed corners. Or maybe it stemmed from the profound isolation of his position as the divine emperor. He existed in a bubble where no advisor dared contradict him, no friend could challenge his whims, and no voice could ever utter the simple truth that he was wrong, fostering a godlike delusion untethered from reality. Yet, the most pivotal catalyst, the event that truly shattered his fragile sanity, was undoubtedly the catastrophic loss of the one person he professed to love. With an intensity bordering on the divine, his beloved Poppaea Sabina. Poppaea Sabina was no ordinary woman. She was the epitome of everything Nero craved in a partner, a mirror to his own grandiose self-perception. Her beauty was legendary, described in ancient texts as transcending mortal bounds, with features that could launch 1,000 ships or inspire epic poems. But her allure went far beyond the superficial. She possessed a razor-sharp intellect that matched Nero's own inflated ego, allowing her to engage in philosophical debates and artistic critiques that flattered his sense of superiority. Moreover, her ambition burned as fiercely as his, aligning perfectly with his dreams of etching their names into the eternal annals of glory, perhaps through grand architectural projects or cultural revolutions. Yet, Poppaea was far from a passive ornament in the opulent halls of the imperial court. She wielded a formidable political savvy, honed through years of navigating Rome's treacherous elite circles, making her an invaluable ally who could orchestrate alliances or dismantle rivals with subtle precision, or a potential enemy whose wrath could topple dynasties. When Nero first set eyes upon Poppaea, he was already bound in matrimony to Octavia, the dutiful daughter of the late Emperor Claudius. Their union had been a calculated political maneuver, devoid of passion, warmth, or even basic affection, a cold alliance forged in the fires of ambition, rather than the heart. Poppaea, in stark contrast, represented the antithesis of Octavia's subdued existence. Where Octavia was quiet, reserved, and content to fade into the background of court life, Poppaea was vivacious, commanding, and unapologetically bold, thriving as the radiant focal point of every gathering, her presence drawing eyes like a magnet. The affair between Nero and Poppaea erupted as one might expect in the scandal-ridden world of Roman high society, a clandestine romance fueled by stolen glances and secret rendezvous. But what began as mere adultery soon metastasized into something infinitely more perilous, a genuine, all-consuming obsession that gripped Nero's soul like a vice. Ancient historians, from Suetonius to Cassius Dio, paint vivid portraits of Nero's behavior during this tumultuous period, depicting him as increasingly erratic, possessive, and unhinged. He would explode into fits of murderous rage at the slightest provocation, such as if another nobleman dared to let his gaze linger too long on Poppaea during a lavish banquet or public ceremony. To ensure her fidelity, or perhaps to assuage his own insecurities, he stationed elite guards around her at all hours, claiming it was for her protection against assassins, but in truth, it was a surveillance net to monitor her every conversation, every gesture, every fleeting interaction. His devotion manifested in extravagant gestures that strained the empire's vast treasury. To its limits, he imported priceless jewels from the exotic mines of India, sumptuous silks woven in the distant workshops of China, and rare perfumes distilled from the aromatic blooms of Arabia, all lavished upon her in a ceaseless torrent of opulence. But perhaps the most insidious sign of his fixation was how he began to bend reality itself to accommodate his desires, reshaping the world around him like a sculptor molding clay. The first major step in this distortion was his abrupt divorce from Octavia, a move that shocked the conservative Roman establishment and alienated key supporters, who viewed it as a betrayal of sacred traditions and political stability. Undeterred, Nero then orchestrated a full imperial wedding to Poppaea, transforming the event into a spectacle of unprecedented luxury and grandeur, sparing no expense to broadcast his undying devotion to the world. Golden chariots, exotic animals paraded through the streets, and feasts that could feed entire legions, all designed to immortalize their union. Yet, even the sanctity of marriage proved insufficient to sate Nero's insatiable need for complete possession. He systematically isolated Poppaea from her family and long-standing friends, surrounding her instead with a cadre of sycophants and courtiers whose loyalties were pledged exclusively to him, ensuring no external influence could dilute his control. He commissioned an array of portraits, sculptures, and mosaics depicting her likeness, not merely for public monuments to glorify the empress, but for his private chambers, where he could gaze upon her image obsessively even in her absence, as if her physical presence alone wasn't enough. Sources from the era reveal even more intimate details of his fixation. Nero would often spend entire hours in silent vigil, simply watching Poppaea as she went about her daily rituals, brushing her hair, reading scrolls, or strolling through the palace gardens. This wasn't the stuff of romantic poetry or courtly love. It was a pathological confusion of affection with ownership, where he perceived her not as an autonomous individual with her own thoughts, dreams, and agency, but as an exquisite, animate object crafted solely for his personal gratification and ego. Poppaea, for her part, was no naive ingenue. She was a woman of profound intelligence and cunning, fully aware of the double-edged sword she wielded. Her unparalleled beauty and Nero's all-encompassing obsession granted her a level of influence unprecedented for any consort, allowing her to shape imperial policy from the shadows. Yet, she was shrewd enough to recognize the inherent dangers, the precarious tightrope she walked, where a single misstep could plunge her into oblivion. To mitigate these risks, she cleverly used her position to advance her family's interests, forging alliances and building a protective network of loyalists who might shield her should Nero's volatile affections ever wane or turn sour. However, Poppaea possessed one critical flaw that would ultimately seal her fate: an unyielding independence that refused to bend entirely to Nero's will. Unlike the fawning courtiers who had mastered the art of anticipating and mirroring the emperor's every mood to ensure their survival, Poppaea retained a spirited autonomy that set her apart. She didn't hesitate to challenge him openly, debating heatedly over matters of state policy, offering pointed criticisms of his artistic endeavors like his self-indulgent poetry or musical compositions, and even mocking his theatrical performances when she deemed them lacking in talent or taste, much to the horror of onlookers who knew the perils of such candor. The exact circumstances of that fateful day in 65 AD remain shrouded in the mists of conflicting historical accounts, varying depending on which ancient chronicler one consults: Tacitus, Suetonius, or Dio, but the tragic outcome is unanimously agreed upon. What commenced as a seemingly ordinary domestic quarrel, perhaps sparked by Nero's late return from the adrenaline-fueled chariot races at the Circus Maximus, or his obsessive preoccupation with his latest theatrical production, escalated with terrifying speed into an irreversible catastrophe. According to Tacitus' detailed narrative, the argument reached its boiling point when Poppaea, emboldened by her position and perhaps exacerbated by the physical and emotional strains of her pregnancy, she was carrying what would have been their second child, dared to confront Nero about his misplaced priorities. She accused him of valuing his public persona and fleeting fame more than his sacred duties as a husband and impending father, words that struck at the core of his insecurities. In that moment of unbridled fury, Nero lost all semblance of control, lashing out with a violence that belied his claims of love. Historians debate the specifics. Some assert it was a single, brutal kick delivered to her swollen abdomen, a reflexive act of rage. Others describe a more sustained and savage assault, with blows raining down until she lay broken and bleeding on the cold, unforgiving marble floor of their opulent chambers. Can you fathom the sheer horror of Nero's realization in the aftermath? This man, who commanded the loyalty of 30 battle-hardened legions, who could condemn souls to death with a mere whisper, who was venerated as a living god in the empire's eastern provinces, had, in a fit of unchecked temper, destroyed the very object of his deepest affections, the one irreplaceable element in his gilded existence. The ancient sources depict the ensuing scene as one of the most pitiful and grotesque in the entire chronicle of Imperial Rome. Nero, overcome with a torrent of remorse and denial, hurled himself upon Poppaea's fading form, his actions oscillating wildly between desperate pleas for forgiveness, as if words could mend the irreparable, and imperious commands for her to defy death itself, as though his divine authority extended even to the underworld. He frantically summoned the finest physicians from across the city, dangling promises of unimaginable wealth for her salvation while threatening unspeakable tortures should they fail. But all efforts were in vain. Poppaea succumbed within hours, her life ebbing away along with the unborn child who might have secured Nero's legacy. As a dynastic founder, it was in this crucible of loss that something essential within Nero's mind fractured beyond repair, plunging him into an abyss of grief that transcended mere emotional pain and veered into outright psychosis. His mourning rituals became the stuff of legend, a macabre theater that horrified even the most jaded members of Roman society, defying traditional Roman funerary customs that mandated cremation to release the soul. Nero ordered her body to be embalmed in the Egyptian style, preserving it in a state of eerie lifelikeness, and interred it in a monumental tomb that dwarfed those of his predecessors in scale and splendor. He went further, proclaiming her divinity and establishing a state-sponsored cult in her honor, complete with temples, priests, and annual festivals. In his private anguish, he spent days conversing with her preserved corpse, whispering secrets and sharing plans as if she could still respond. Her silent form a tragic audience to his unraveling. The imperial court, already a den of intrigue and fear, now navigated an even more treacherous terrain. Courtiers were compelled to participate in Nero's delusional charade, referring to Poppaea in the present tense as if she lingered among the living, leaving her favored seat vacant. At elaborate banquets, and even incorporating her preferences into daily decisions, any soul foolish enough to suggest that the emperor should grieve and move forward faced swift retribution, exile to remote provinces at best, execution at worst. It was amid this atmosphere of enforced madness that Sporus unwittingly entered the stage, his life forever altered by a glance from the broken emperor. Sporus was likely no more than 14 or 15 years old at the time, a youth born into the harsh realities of slavery within the sprawling imperial household. He had been granted freedom as a child, a common practice for promising young servants, and raised within the palace walls, with an education tailored for administrative roles, learning literacy, mathematics, and the intricacies of court protocol. In the stratified world of ancient Rome, this was a position of relative privilege. Freedmen in imperial service often enjoyed comforts and opportunities surpassing those of many freeborn citizens. From the lower classes, with access to fine meals, education, and potential advancement. However, this elevated status came at a steep cost: total dependence on the emperor's favor. Freedmen owed their very existence to their patron's whims, rendering them utterly vulnerable, capable of rising to influential heights one day, only to be discarded, punished, or slain without warning or legal protection the next. What drew Nero's obsessive attention to Sporus wasn't his budding intellect, his skills in record-keeping, or any personal merit. It was purely superficial, a quirk of fate in his physical appearance. Multiple historical accounts concur that the young man bore an uncanny, almost supernatural resemblance to the late Poppaea, particularly in the delicate structure of his face, the almond-shaped eyes, the refined cheekbones, the subtle curve of his lips. In Roman culture, where physical likeness was often interpreted as a sign of deeper spiritual or karmic connections, perhaps even reincarnation, this similarity would have appeared as a divine omen, a gift from the gods to mend what had been shattered. The first encounter between Nero and Sporus after Poppaea's death ignited a spark in the emperor's fractured psyche. Here, before him, was an opportunity to reverse the irreversible, to resurrect the lost through a vessel of flesh and blood. For a fleeting moment, Nero might have genuinely believed he was witnessing Poppaea's spirit reborn, her essence transferred into this youthful form. Of course, there was one glaring impediment to this fantasy. Sporus was unequivocally male, but to a man who had elevated himself to godhood, who had spent months in communion with a lifeless body, altering something as fundamental as gender seemed a trivial hurdle, a mere adjustment in the grand tapestry of his will. What followed was an act of calculated, systematic cruelty that ranks among the most heinous in recorded history, a deliberate campaign to dismantle Sporus' very humanity. Nero didn't content himself with superficial changes, like forcing the boy to don women's clothing or adopt feminine mannerisms. No, his vision was far more invasive and permanent. He summoned the empire's most skilled surgeon's men, versed in the rudimentary medical arts of the time, and commanded them to perform a radical operation, castration and further modifications, to reshape Sporus' body into a more feminine form, erasing his masculinity at its core. This procedure was not only excruciatingly painful, but extraordinarily dangerous in an era without antibiotics or sterile techniques, with high risks of infection, hemorrhage, or death. Even if successful, it would leave Sporus forever altered and incapable of fathering children, barred from normal romantic relationships, and stigmatized in Roman society as neither fully male nor female, a liminal figure shunned by norms. The surgery unfolded within the opulent confines of the Imperial palace, in specially prepared chambers that belied the horror within. Ancient medical practices were primitive, relying on basic tools like scalpels and cauterizing irons, with only crude anesthetics such as opium or wine to dull the agony. Sporus would have been restrained by guards, his cries echoing through the halls as the physicians worked for hours, indifferent to his suffering under the emperor's unyielding orders. Recovery, if it came at all, spanned weeks or even months of bedridden torment, marked by fever, pain, and the slow dawning of his new reality. Once Sporus had healed sufficiently, Nero unveiled his next shocking decree, one that sent ripples of disbelief through even the most cynical Roman aristocrats. He would marry the young man in a full imperial wedding ceremony, treating it as a legitimate union. Preparations consumed months and vast resources from the treasury. Sporus was stripped of his name and rechristened Sabina after the dead empress, and relocated to luxurious quarters where a team of attendants began his transformation. Imperial seamstresses crafted an extensive wardrobe of gowns and robes designed to flatter his altered physique while concealing any lingering masculine traits, using fabrics of the finest quality embroidered with gold thread. Master jewelers forged custom ornaments, many incorporating gems that had once graced Poppaea's own neck or wrists, tangible relics that linked Sporus to her ghost, turning adornments into chains of memory. The indoctrination extended beyond attire. Makeup artists from across the empire tutored him in the arts of cosmetics, how to apply kohl to enlarge and dramatize his eyes, rouge to impart a rosy glow to his cheeks, and fine powders to soften the angles of his face, erasing traces of his former self layer by layer. These sessions weren't mere beautification, they were rituals of identity erasure, forcing Sporus to confront a stranger in every mirror. Hairdressers instructed him in the elaborate styling favored by Roman noble women, cutting, curling, and arranging his locks into complex updos adorned with pearls and pins, a process that could take hours each day, with heated tools and multiple servants assisting. But the most psychologically devastating aspects were the lessons in feminine deportment and behavior. Assigned a cadre of tutors likely experienced court ladies or actors, Sporus was drilled relentlessly in how to embody womanhood, walking with a graceful sway rather than a confident stride, sitting with demure posture and crossed legs, gesturing delicately with his hands to convey elegance over strength. He learned to position his feet just so, to arrange his clothing when seated to maintain modesty, and to move through spaces with an air of refined poise. Voice coaches labored to alter his speech patterns, teaching him to raise his pitch, soften his tone, and adopt linguistic quirks associated with feminine discourse in Roman society's subtle inflections, polite phrases, and avoided directness. This was perhaps the hardest change, as vocal habits are deeply ingrained, requiring constant conscious effort that bordered on torture. Can you even begin to comprehend the mental anguish of this forced metamorphosis? Each day, Sporus awoke to a world where mirrors reflected back a distorted alien wearing his face, every lesson hammering away at his core self, every piece of jewelry once worn by a woman he'd never met serving as a shackle binding him to an unchosen destiny. The psychological toll was immense, a daily assault on his sense of self, turning his existence into a prison of performance. The wedding itself was timed for the spring of 67 AD, coinciding with auspicious religious festivals to lend it ceremonial legitimacy and divine blessing. Nero spared no expense, treating it as the pinnacle of imperial unions, an event worthy of history's greatest rulers. The ceremony unfolded in the largest hall of the palace, lavishly decorated with imported flowers from across the Mediterranean, roses from Persia, lilies from Egypt illuminated by thousands of flickering oil lamps that cast a golden glow. Musicians played traditional hymns on lyres and flutes, while servants circulated with platters of the finest wines, exotic fruits, and delicacies like roasted peacock and spiced dormice. To outsiders unaware of the backstory, it might have resembled a standard grand wedding. But for those in the inner circle, it was a surreal nightmare. The emperor publicly marrying a surgically altered teenage boy dressed and presented as his deceased wife. The rituals proceeded with meticulous adherence to Roman tradition, exchanging vows before priests, joining hands in symbolic unity, sharing sacred bread as a sign of shared life, and signing legal documents to formalize the bond. Guests, a mix of senators, generals, and foreign dignitaries, performed their roles with practiced poise, offering congratulations, toasts, and extravagant gifts like gold statues or rare slaves. Yet, beneath the veneer of celebration, the atmosphere crackled with suppressed horror, morbid fascination, and the nervous tension of witnessing something profoundly unnatural and wrong. In the wake of the wedding, Nero treated Sporus precisely as he would a true empress, bestowing upon him all the trappings of royal status. Sporus received his own household staff of servants and guards, opulent quarters within the palace complex furnished with silks and marbles, and a generous stipend drawn directly from the imperial treasury for personal expenses. He was provided with a custom litter for travel through Rome's streets, fine horses for outings, and a retinue of attendants to cater to his every need. On the surface, this was a life of unimaginable luxury, far removed from his humble origins. But such privileges exacted a devastating price: the complete obliteration of his original identity, and the perpetual enactment of a role that eroded his soul. Sporus was required to accompany Nero to all public functions, from senatorial meetings to grand spectacles, sitting beside him at state dinners and playing the part of the devoted spouse in every interaction. This wasn't mere pageantry. Nero appeared to genuinely believe he had resurrected Poppaea, addressing Sporus by her name, recounting fabricated shared memories from a life that never was, and expecting responses that upheld the illusion. For Sporus, every waking moment became a high-stakes improvisation, where a single slip, forgetting a detail from Poppaea's past or failing to react appropriately, could invite lethal punishment. Ancient sources note that Sporus adapted with eerie proficiency, developing an intuitive ability to anticipate Nero's moods and tailor his responses, becoming a master of deception for survival. Yet, they also describe him growing increasingly withdrawn, his eyes shadowed with melancholy. Though he maintained flawless composure in public view, the psychological burden is almost beyond imagination, awakening each morning in chambers decorated to evoke a dead woman's tastes, staring at reflections that bore no resemblance to his true self, engaging in conversations that demanded he inhabit another's memories and experiences. This bizarre existence endured for over 2 years, a period of sustained torment masked by imperial splendor. The ordeal intensified when Nero embarked on a grand tour of Greece, where he fancied himself a supreme artist and competed in festivals like the Olympics, rigging victories to feed his ego. Sporus, naturally, accompanied him as the empress, paraded before foreign dignitaries and Greek elites, who struggled to reconcile the conqueror's eccentricities with the obvious fiction before them. A teenage boy in drag demanded to be treated as royal consort. By 68 AD, however, Nero's cumulative excesses, financial ruin, neglect of governance, and tyrannical whims had eroded his support base. Rebellions erupted across provinces, led by disgruntled governors weary of his instability. The Praetorian Guard, once his bulwark, defected, and the Senate branded him an enemy of the state. As chaos engulfed Rome, Nero fled the capital with a small band of loyalists, Sporus among them. Even in flight, the emperor couldn't abandon his living talisman of Poppaea. They sought refuge in a secluded villa outside the city, where Nero vacillated between delusional escape schemes, perhaps fleeing to Egypt, or rallying distant legions, and theatrical preparations for suicide, quoting tragic verses from plays. When word arrived that pursuers were closing in, Nero finally chose death, stabbing himself with assistance. His last words a lament for the loss of such an artist as himself. His suicide left Sporus in a precarious limbo, as a living symbol of Nero's depravity. He was both a trophy for victors and a liability to be exploited or eliminated. What followed was arguably even more tragic than his time with Nero. Sporus became a political pawn, passed like inherited property among the short-lived emperors of the chaotic year of the four emperors, first claimed by Nymphidius Sabinus, a Praetorian prefect with ambitions, then by Otho, Nero's successor who briefly held the throne, and finally by Vitellius. Each man perpetuated the grotesque charade, keeping Sporus dressed as a woman and addressing him as Poppaea, using him as a bizarre link to Nero's legacy for their own perverse amusements, or political theater. It was under Vitellius' reign that Sporus' nightmare culminated in ultimate degradation. The new emperor planned to feature him in a public spectacle at the Colosseum, a reenactment of mythological tales involving ritual violence and sexual humiliation, turning Sporus into entertainment for the baying crowds of thousands. Faced with this final, unbearable indignity being violated and mocked on the grandest stage, Sporus seized the only agency left to him after years of subjugation. He chose self-inflicted death, likely by poison, sometime in 69 AD. He was probably no older than 20, his youth stolen in its prime. In death, Sporus at last escaped the macabre pageant that had defined his existence. His story endured as a cautionary fable in ancient texts, warning of the perils of absolute power and the human toll of imperial folly. Yet, those same historians often treated him more as a symbol of decadence than a flesh-and-blood victim, glossing over his personal suffering in favor of moralizing about Rome's decline. What renders his tale so profoundly haunting isn't merely the physical abuses he endured, the surgery, the forced transformation, but the methodical stripping of his identity and autonomy. From the instant Nero noted his resemblance to Poppaea, Sporus ceased to be an individual with hopes, fears, and dreams. He became a blank canvas for the emperor's twisted projections, a puppet in a play he never auditioned for. The fact that Sporus ultimately chose suicide over further humiliation speaks volumes. Beneath the layers of enforced femininity, the relentless conditioning, and the imperial facade, a flicker of his original self persisted, a core of resilience and defiance that refused utter annihilation. His death was both a profound tragedy and a final, poignant act of rebellion, asserting control over his fate when all else had been denied. Perhaps the most heart-wrenching aspect is how little we know of the real Sporus. Before his ordeal, the boy he once was, what were his aspirations as a freed slave? Did he dream of scholarly pursuits, administrative glory, or simple freedom? All such details were erased, supplanted by the role of Nero's living doll, his true essence vanishing into historical oblivion. The youth coerced into impresshood, who bore years of unrelenting psychological and physical torment, who ultimately elected death over deeper debasement. His narrative merits remembrance, not as a mere footnote or curiosity from ancient Rome, but as an enduring testament to the extremes of human cruelty and the quiet strength of human resilience. By claiming his own end, Sporus reclaimed the singular power withheld from him throughout his tormented adulthood, the right to decide his destiny. This story serves as a somber reminder that behind every glittering facade of historical grandeur, the triumphs, the monuments, the legends lie countless individual tales of suffering, survival, and quiet heroism that demand our attention, our empathy, and our reflection. Even as 2,000 years stretch between us like an unbridgeable chasm,